I think it is clear to believe in the power of ideas.
Fresh thinking to the Manhattan Institute.
Our next panel, there's a pension crisis. Are we in agreement on that in this room? Can I hear a yes or a no? All right, you're here, so I'm assuming you agree there is a pension crisis. So the question now among responsible Americans is, how do we fix it? And how do we fix it now versus, say, 10 or 15 years in the future? I'd like to invite our panelists up to the stage now to join us. We're going to follow a somewhat, yes? Oh, here you are. We're doing a lot of scene changes today. We're going to follow a somewhat faster tempo with this panel, more of an interview process based on questions. But I think the key is that our next conversation needs to probe the question, what are the different options on the table that lead to a sustainable and fair retirement system for our public workforce? So, for example, is there a single best approach that can be used, or do we need a mix of measures? And do cities need a federal backstop to get out of this hole? For example, should state constitutions be amended, or should legislatures work within existing language to try to change the game? What about bankruptcy as an option? We've heard that talked about this morning. And also, how do we view public sector unions in this process? Friend, foe, collaborator, detractor? Can they play a constructive role? And what about the role of public finance in all of this? Now, shortly, we're going to be joined live from Los Angeles by the former mayor, Dick Riordan. But in the meantime, I want to start with bankruptcy, if that's possible, and look at that as one of the possible options on the table. I'd like to turn to you, Eileen. Eileen Norcross is a senior fellow at the Mercatus Center at George Washington University. We're deeply appreciative that you came up here, and you can read Eileen's work in the Wall Street Journal, Forbes, U.S. News and World Report. Just about any credible publication is publishing her work on this issue right now. So Eileen, Detroit, the largest municipal bankruptcy in U.S. history, it's kind of become the poster child for what happens when public labor costs balloon out of control and there's no mechanism to correct course. At the same time, the city bankruptcy proceedings now have put reform measures on the table that prior to now were politically unthinkable. In your opinion, is this a viable option for pushing through structural changes?
I think it's a live issue right now, of course, and Kevin Orr, who is the emergency manager there, has signaled that pensioners are going to have to share in the pain with possible cuts to bondholders. And what the unions are doing is they're trying to challenge, even if Detroit should be in bankruptcy at all, they challenge the constitutionality of the emergency manager law. And they seem to feel that they're owed these benefits and that they can't be impaired. So right now they're presenting arguments as to whether, what the court's going to decide. I don't think we can say. But I think that, as was mentioned earlier, a lot of the abuses that went on in the system, which I think flows from the fictitious accounting and gave the city council the impression they had this excess money and they can cut these checks. Interestingly, the New York Times yesterday pointed out that might give the unions a leg up in their arguments, that the fact that there are these excess funds gives these benefits a sort of, there was no reason for them to go into bankruptcy. So it's a live issue.
So can this be a strategy, though, or is it really more just of if we end up in bankruptcy, there are some options on the table, but perhaps proactively we shouldn't be trying to incentivize bankruptcy in cities, in your opinion?
Well, I think bankruptcy would unfold differently depending on the state and the circumstances. So in California, you have a very different set of circumstances. And interestingly there, CalPERS seems to feel that San Bernardino doesn't even have the right to be in bankruptcy right now, that pensions are sacred and you can't touch them as a part of a potential municipal bankruptcy.
Well,
and then, of course, Central Falls, the other example, Rhode Island, you have a case where the state moved to protect bondholders first and gave Central Falls the ability to, they cut pension benefits there. So I think it's going to unfold differently depending on the state.
Sure. Well, I'd like to bring Dan DiSalvo into the conversation at this point. Dan is an assistant professor of political science at the City University of New York, CUNY, and of course a senior fellow here at the Manhattan Institute. Dan, in Detroit, we see public labor unions. They filed suit against the governor. It's going down, in fact, as we speak, and the Detroit emergency manager, Kevin Orr, to try to derail this bankruptcy filing. If for a moment we maintain the goal that working with public sector unions in the reform process is important, can bankruptcy be an option?
Well, I mean, once you're into bankruptcy, it's already an adversarial relationship in the courts. So in that regard, I think the important thing to think about is the overall politics of public employee pensions and how dramatically, I would say, the political landscape has changed in the last couple of years since the Great Recession beginning in 2008. You could have said, I think, for the 20 or 30 years prior to that, you had a pretty stable political arrangement, which was that in most cities and states, Democrats favored expanding and making the pensions more generous through a variety of legislative techniques, partly because they were often allied with public employee unions, partly because Democrats instinctually favor government service. And Republicans basically went along with this. There was no reason to raise any red flags. There was no pressure on Republicans to, in a sense, behave like Republicans and worry about this. So they basically went along with these measures. The problems were seen as very technical. The public was uninformed. They didn't understand the language of accounting. So there was pretty much no incentive for Republicans to do much. That's really changed, I think, in the last couple of years dramatically. Now Democrats are divided. Democrats want some, especially those in executive positions, governors and mayors, see the problems of crowding out discussed on the last panel, and they want to do something about it. So they're leading reform, and I think that's where you could look. On the other side, Republicans are now coming under a lot more pressure from think tanks, from activist groups, and others to start behaving like Republicans or conservatives on this issue and to push for more retrenchment. Now, to Michael's question on the unions, I think the unions here are also on new ground. And it's not simply, although the recent examples of Detroit and elsewhere seem like the unions only go into an oppositional mode where they want to push back and hold the line and use lawsuits and bankruptcies to say the statutory protections of the commerce of the Constitution, of state laws, of local ordinances, those will defend us and we don't have to make any change. But I think that there's really two options for the unions, and one is at least more favorable to reform. You could say in one sense, when it comes to the generosity of pensions, unions' incentives to pressure politicians to make them more generous, that's obvious. They want to do better by their members, and they'll use their political influence to do that because pensions in most places aren't collectively bargained. Mm-hmm. But when it comes to the funding status, you could see at least in one scenario, unions say, look, we have to be concerned about our members' retirement. Therefore, we should also use our political influence to ensure that politicians well fund the plans. So stronger unions, better funded pensions, and one might say, okay, New York would be an example of that.
Well, I'm gonna take from this that
sure.
Bankruptcy is not necessarily the best option on the table to try to reform our public pension system. But I appreciate your perspectives on it. And we're joined now live by Dick Riordan from Los Angeles, the former mayor of the city of LA. Mr. Mayor, how are you?
Fine, doing great.
Thank you so much for being with us. Well, I want to say a few kind words about you before you get started.
Right.
Mayor, can you hear us?
I can hear you.
And we can hear you too, can't we? Mayor Riordan was mayor of LA from 1993 to 2001, and what an impressive tenure it was. His campaign pledge, he was going to be tough enough to turn LA around. I believe he fulfilled that. Since moving on from elective office, the mayor has doubled down on his commitment to be active in public service and managing his foundation and working on pension reform. And as the mayor knows, and some of you might know, he tried in May of 2012 to get a measure on the ballot that would move existing workers in LA from these defined benefit plans we've been talking about all morning over to defined contribution plans. That effort came up short, and what I think is so notable is that despite that, you've gone further now, and you're even more engaged in this issue. Mr. Mayor, thanks for joining us here on the East Coast. I'd like to focus, if we may now, on another option that's been talked about, and that's the role of the federal government. Is there a role for the federal government, specifically on this issue, federal loan guarantees or federal bond insurance? You wrote about this recently with Tim Rutten, a former LA Times journalist. You put a New York Times op-ed about talking about federal bond insurance. Tell us, how do you think that plays into this?
Well, before I do that, let me mention that the reason I failed in Los Angeles was I didn't get enough signatures to put it on the ballot. When it goes on the ballot, as we found out in San Diego and San Jose, the public will overwhelmingly approve changes. Now, getting back to the federal government and their role in it, the president, Congress there should look at the fact that in the next several years, you're going to see city after city, state after state go bankrupt. They'll be closing down parks, they'll be closing down libraries, they'll be cutting police in half. The duration or time it takes for an ambulance to come to your house in an emergency will quadruple in the amount of time. So Professor Roush, who's going to talk to you, I think, sometime today from Stanford, had come up with a plan which I love. I think the federal government, the president can't stand there and watch his country go to waste and not do something about it. And what Roush has is that we take the Treasury Department as a center of this, and they come up with a program which is similar to the race to the top we have in education, where you say that we will have an insurance fund, that the states have to put money into it, the federal government will put money into it, but you, the states, have to do A through G, including things like you have to switch to a realistic accounting system. You have to have realistic amounts as the average of what you can make on your investments. You're going to have to stop spiking of wages in last years of somebody's employment, and on and on and on. Of course, the main thing, by the way, go to a defined contribution type of system. But at that point, you can have the Treasury blessed by guaranteeing bonds, and you can do those bonds probably at a lot lower rate than you would on your own, which will give you much better financial stabilization.
Well, Mr. Mayor, a follow-up question. So I'm hearing you articulate a number of reforms that would almost have to be followed through before a city and perhaps even a state could get this insurance. But is there not substantial risk that these cities or even states would almost have an incentive to kind of just do the easiest things or the bare minimum and really not go after the structural changes that are needed? Or would that not be an option? Under this plan, you have to do these really tough structural changes to get these guarantees.
Well, it would not be an option because the Treasury would have to make the decision. Did they meet it or did they not? And if they didn't meet it, they would not be given the insurance. Now, I realize government is not the most efficient thing in the world, so I think other people who will be here today can talk about what are the chances that government can run this program adequately.
Well, I appreciate that. I'd like to now bring in Steve Malanga. Steve is a senior fellow here at the Manhattan Institute, and in a previous life, you were the executive editor of Crane's New York Business. He's also a frequent contributor to publicsectorinc.org, where many of you are watching this broadcast. Steve, you've examined the mayor's plan. In your opinion, might federal bond insurance help more in certain cities and states than in others, or is it a blanket solution?
No, well, unquestionably it would, and that, of course, creates the problem with putting this into effect. And the problem is this, is that we do have 50 states and thousands of municipalities, and not all of them are in the kind of mess that they're in right now, and many of them would be asked in any federal program, depending upon what it costs, and costing out something like this is something that I'm sure the CBO and a lot of other people would do. Many of them would be asked to pay for this, and so they would, I think, either object or more properly perhaps demand kind of airtight programs along the lines that the mayor suggests. Now, what does that mean? This is, I think, important to understand. How do we want to do this to protect taxpayers from a loss of services, but what we also want to do is not recreate the problem all over again by simply allowing people to refund themselves and then see this problem emerge 5 years from now. Vallejo, California, for instance, went into bankruptcy in part because of its pension problems, decided not to contest its pension issues because CalPERS was essentially promised to fight them in court. And as a result of that, 4 years later, Vallejo is back in fiscal trouble because of the pension system. So what you need to understand is that the defined benefit plan, as it's been created in the states, is filled with loopholes that have to be closed if there are going to be any federal guarantees. And this is important because around the country you see states doing pension reform. 40 states have claimed they've done pension reform in the past 3 or 4 years. Very few of them, in doing pension reform, are closing these loopholes. What are the loopholes? The first loophole is, frankly, you're allowed as a state, even though 49 states have essentially constitutional restrictions against running a deficit, states consistently do not fund their pensions fully, even by the accounting standards that they use. Now, Professor Ross said before that if you use private sector accounting standards, then all states are running deficits. But even by the accounting standards that they use, according to a recent study done by Pew, 29 of 50 states did not make their full pension contributions, and out of 61 cities, major cities they studied, more than half did not. So number one, you have to make your pension contribution if you're going to get this money. Number two is that essentially, as the mayor said, the system of accounting has to be formalized. Now, someone from governing asked Professor Rao the question, what's the difference and why can't we do this? And he gave a good accounting answer. There's also the political or the constitutional answer, and that is federalism. You can't essentially compel the states to do this unless you are offering something and they are doing it in exchange. It is not just discount rates or investment rates that they are manipulating. It is the entire accounting system, including legislation that has been put in place, for instance, to do things that Marcus Winters described, push back or change the rate of accrual and the rate at which they essentially fund pensions so that it's called backloading, basically, and a whole bunch of other things that they do. Finally, the final thing that I believe you would have to do as part of a guarantee, and this might involve constitutional changes, and we'll talk about this later, is you have to eliminate the restrictions in constitutions that have mostly been interpreted by state courts. You have to eliminate the restrictions which say you can never change a pension system, including for work that has not yet been done. This does not exist in ERISA, where in ERISA you are allowed in the private sector. You cannot take away benefits that someone has earned, unless you're in bankruptcy, obviously. You cannot take away those benefits, but you can change going forward the rate of accrual. If we do not do this, it is impossible to believe that you can manage these systems, because as far as, for instance, the state of California Supreme Court has said, anybody going to work and their first day today for the state of California, you can never change the rate at which they earn benefits. So for the next 30 years, they would earn those benefits at that rate, and then if they are retired for 25 years after that, you have to pay. So you've committed to 55 years for this person. You cannot do this. So those would be three things, I think, that you would absolutely have to change to stop these systems from being manipulated.
So we're seeing that there appears to be a role that the federal government could play, but with a lot of buts and a lot of clear measures that would have to be adhered to make this viable. We've spent a bit of time now talking about bankruptcy. We've spoken a bit about the federal role. I'd like to turn squarely towards reform and again mention to you a report we just put out by Rick Dreyfuss, who's one of our senior fellows, that outlines 20 different myths of reform. And you heard earlier Governor Engler referencing a report from the Mackinac Center that looked at that reform in Michigan, and Rick was also the author of that piece. So there's some really good nuggets in there about what is reform and what isn't. And Steve, you started to touch on that. But let's take a detour over to the state of California, not just for your benefit, Mr. Mayor, but also for yours, Mr. Mayor. We'd like to talk a bit about California. Mayor Riordan, just last Thursday, it was reported that you had lent your support to a statewide ballot measure that is in the works, being championed by our next keynote speaker, San Jose Mayor Chuck Reed. And we'll be hearing from Mayor Reed shortly on the details. But the measure essentially aims to give mayors the ability to effect meaningful change to their city's pension systems. And meaningful change, just to be clear, means that you could change the terms of employment for future and current workers. So you could actually start to do something now. In your opinion, Mayor Riordan, are we starting to see a demarcation of battle lines on this issue, where you have mayors who are forced to deal with budget deficits on the ground in real time versus state lawmakers who are often insulated from the direct results of these retirement promises that they negotiate and approve?
Well, as pointed out by the last speaker, it's very, very complicated. We are seeing things like that. We're seeing, San Jose, which is a highly democratic city, voted 70% for changes in the pension plans. Right now, we have, as pointed out by the latest speaker, that right now the Constitution of California has to be changed to make all of the pension changes that the cities need. You're seeing in cities like LA now, the president of the city council, after fighting me to put enough names on the ballot to have an election in LA, has now appointed a very excellent mixture of Republicans and Democrats to study this whole problem. So I think you're going to gradually, as people see the end right at their fingertips, you're going to see people, unions and others ready to make changes.
I appreciate that. And Steve, in your opinion, are we maybe seeing a template in the making here with Mayor Reed's initiative? Is there a possible template here for other states and cities?
For the longest time, no one talked about constitutional changes precisely because they are so difficult. But now, as we are getting into essentially a desperate situation, we're going to hear more and more talk about that. And one of the reasons we're going to hear more and more talk about that is because these obligations are not going away, and they are very, very hard to pay off. The issue of constitutional restrictions is, in my opinion, one of the most misunderstood in the country. I've spoken to legislators in states who said we can't change our benefits, our Constitution says so, and I've asked them where, I've asked them why, because I know that in fact that's untrue, and they believe that. Here is essentially where we are with the issue of constitutional restrictions. They are mostly constitutional restrictions because state Supreme Courts have ruled this way. There are only 7 states which mention pensions in their Constitution. And in 3 or 4 of those states, the courts have ruled that the mention of pensions only protects benefits that have been earned, which means you can change them. Why do you have so many other states where you have a problem? Because essentially, Supreme Courts in more than 24 states, state Supreme Courts, have interpreted pensions as a contract, and as a special contract in which you cannot change any terms of the contract, not only for work already done, I mean, you can't take work away retroactively, but you also cannot change prospectively for work that has not yet even been done. Now, this is, first of all, nothing like federal contract law. Legal scholars who have looked at this, and they've looked specifically at California, that's known as the California rule, and more than a dozen states follow this rule, the state Supreme Courts. They have looked at the logic of the California Supreme Court and say that the court just makes a leap. That in contract law in general, it is not unconstitutional to change contracts prospectively, to change terms prospectively. This is something that state Supreme Courts have essentially put on the public. And it may be that in places, because of that, if you don't change your Supreme Court, which is a very difficult thing to do, if you don't change the nature of your Supreme Court, the only other way to do it is the way that Mayor Reed is suggesting do it, which is to put specific language into your Constitution that say you can do this. This has not been done to this extent. There has been one constitutional change that I know of so far, and that was in New Jersey, and it was a very limited case, but it was a very interesting case. When New Jersey did pension reform, their Constitution, their state Supreme Court has never said that it's prohibited to make prospective changes. So they allowed it for everybody except judges, because the judges who are part of the state pension system, in the New Jersey Constitution, it does actually say you can't diminish the compensation of judges. It's obviously it's a protective issue. The New Jersey judiciary actually interpreted that to mean that the clause in the pension reform that said that judges had to contribute more into their pensions was a diminishment of their compensation. That so outraged the governor and the Democratic legislature that they immediately put a ballot on the New Jersey ballot. They put an initiative on the New Jersey ballot to take that language out of the New Jersey Constitution, and 83% of voters approved it. Now, nobody lobbied against it the way public unions might lobby against other constitutions.
Well, Steve, you mentioned the California rule, and if I had $1 for every time that the California rule led to something across the country, I'd probably be a wealthy person. But perhaps this time the California rule will go in a good direction and serve as a template elsewhere. Dan, you've written extensively about California public sector unions. It was about 1.5 years ago. You looked at the ballot initiative and referendum process and how unions influence that and how they do in terms of measures they care about and the ones that they're trying to block. Do you see anything that could be different coming down the pike this time because of the new face of reform being mayors versus, say, business interest groups?
Well, I think it'll probably be hard fought. I mean, the biggest thing I think is getting the unions. They're facing a big choice in all of these situations, and certainly with the referendum, they'll be facing a choice whether they go all in to oppose it, that is mobilizing their members, buying lots of TV ads, and so on. I think the mayors have an advantage in the sense that it's a bipartisan group, that they also have the advantage that these issues have gotten a lot more coverage in the news media in recent years, and in California in particular. That is that the results of just the thing in San Jose itself is indicative that the public can be mobilized on behalf of this measure. I'd say will probably be a very hard-fought battle. The overall thing, I think, for reformers is that, and this was mentioned by Governor Engler, and this is, I think, demonstrated by Gino Raimondo in Rhode Island, as well as some recent examples in Lexington, Kentucky, is in some ways you need almost a third party to do the books and say that these are the genuine numbers, and that in that sense it puts an enormous amount of pressure on the unions not to say, oh, it's just these are politicized figures. And once you have some numbers that everyone, the unions and the politicians of both parties agree on, then you can really say that this puts pressure on everyone to act.
So that's the view from academia, having been studied. Mayor Riordan, your thoughts as someone who's been on the ground looking at this?
Well, I agree with everything he's saying, but it's not going to be easy. You're going to need brains like the people who are talking to your conference today to get together and to look at all the problems. I mean, who would have imagined that you had to separate the judges from the rest in New Jersey? It seems obvious in hindsight, but in foresight, it's the type of thing that is not put in something that makes the thing almost irrelevant.
Exactly. And Eileen, your thoughts on this?
I just wanted to jump in with something that was just mentioned. First, I understand, even with the great reforms that Rhode Island was able to accomplish, there are now negotiations with unions behind closed doors. So that just points to the difficulty and the politics involved here. And also, on the figures, on how politicized they can be, it seems to be a consistent argument of unions that when you present them with let's say a fair market value, or even something that's, let's drop the discount rate down by 1%, that these numbers are then suspect. And you saw that, I think, very much in Detroit, where they said they had, I think, a $644 million gap, and that was their first estimate, but the emergency manager said, no, it's closer to $3.5 billion, and I did a rough calculation, I thought it was closer to $9.5 billion. And
that's a substantial difference, isn't it?
Well, that's
I'd like to look at a fourth kind of driver of change. We've done the federal role, we've looked at bankruptcy, we've taken a detour to California and kind of probed constitutional amendments or constitutional language legislative reforms. Let's talk about public finance. We're in New York City. It's a unique perspective on this issue. Let's start with the municipal bond market. And Eileen, I'll go back to you to start if you don't mind. Do you think it's likely that muni bankers are essentially, with their analysis and with the credit ratings that are going to be coming out and continue to kind of ding certain cities that aren't doing well, that you're going to see reform start to be moved because of the way the municipal bond market looks at cities and states and their balance sheet, as Governor Engler said earlier?
I think one thing to look for is the fact that Moody's is going to be using this I think roughly 5.5% discount rate. That's going to send a signal about what these pension liabilities actually are. That's going to potentially affect ratings, and it's going to focus local leaders on the true nature of these liabilities, and that, I think, is what to look for.
That's very helpful. Steve?
Well, we've already actually seen it in the most extreme cases, and I'll give you a very quick example. Illinois. Illinois, as many of you know, was using pension obligation bonds for years, not putting any of their own money into the system, borrowing to put money into the system. When it got desperate in 2011, they went back again, and they were going to put more pension obligation bonds, except that Wall Street said, sorry, we cannot countenance you continuing to do this. We're not going to buy, and the underwriter said, we're not going to sell a pension obligation bond anymore. What happened was Illinois had to start contributing its own money into the pension system. What was the result? The result was that they raised taxes in 2011 by $6 billion, and more than half of that money went into the pension system. But to give you an idea of the kind of a mess that Illinois is now in, they were borrowing their ARC, annual required contribution, 6 or 7 years ago was $1.8 billion, and they would borrow money to put it in. Now, because of the way they fund their pension system, their ARC this year is $6 billion on a $31 billion general fund. Almost 20% for a state of their general fund is just for pensions, and they can't borrow anymore. They have to use taxpayer money. That's why, if you want to know why there's talk of an extreme emergency in Illinois, that's why. You can't run a state if 20% of your budget is pensions.
And Mayor Riordan, when you were in Los Angeles, did you start to experience that kind of squeeze from the municipal bond market and kind of as an impetus to start trying to get reform through?
Well, we didn't have the problems when I was there. We had zero unfunded mandates in the pensions, a lot due to the fact the economy was doing well during the 90s. But I think what's going to happen is the trigger that's going to blow this country apart on this is when Wall Street stops buying government bonds. They're going to look very hard at California bonds, like the revenue anticipation bonds that pay the salaries of everybody there, and they're going to say, oh, this is not a risk that we want to take, or we want to get a much higher interest rate. But I think it's going to blow up very shortly.
Notes of doom from California. One last question before we open this up to the audience, and I'm going to dive into the details for a moment because it's in the realm of public finance, or of finance rather in general. But there was a benchmark financial services study which was recently reported on in the New York Times and other publications. And this was a forensic firm that had been hired by the Rhode Island Council of AFSCME, the American Federation of State, County, and Municipal Employees. So, government workers for states, counties, and cities. And the report basically concluded that Rhode Island's $7.7 billion or $8 billion retirement fund was at risk, right? That sounds bad, because of its increased concentration in high-risk, opaque, alternative investments. Now, for those of you who are in finance, that all makes a lot of sense. For those of you who are not and are casual readers of the newspaper, that sounds like a really bad thing. I open this question up to the panel, all perspectives, the political, from the mayor. I read this and I say, wait a second. You have public pension funds that have to guarantee an 8% or approximately 8% rate of return. They have to do this because public sector unions have essentially said, we're going to fight for this and get it into the bylaws and the Constitution. Isn't the ire of this benchmark financial services firm misdirected? Isn't the real issue that there's an 8% guaranteed return and these funds have to figure out how to try to meet it? Eileen, maybe you want to start us off?
Yeah, I've seen those kind of arguments before, and I think Rolling Stone had an article out, maybe it was last week or so, that made a similar type argument, and it's sort of like cognitive dissonance, because what they're saying is, yeah, we want this guaranteed return, and what it ends up happening, one of the behaviors is to encourage more risk-taking on the asset side. So you've seen a shift in public sector plans over the past period of years into things like alternatives and higher risk equities. So indeed, that does in fact build more volatility into the fund, but it's prompted by this accounting, which values the liability as on these high risk returns.
Yeah. Right. If you were to go back to what Professor Ross said in the previous panel, and that is that because of this, what I call dysfunctional accounting that the public pension funds are allowed to use, you are allowed to discount your future liabilities. And we ought to have a chalkboard for how many times the phrase discount your liabilities is used. But if you are allowed essentially to value your pension, your assets for the next 30 years based on your projected rate of return, you are going to project a higher rate of return. And that you cannot do that in the private sector. The two are separated. It is a bad incentive. And so if you do want to have, let's say, that 8% or 7.5%, you can't put all your money in safe investments. You can't put your portfolio in treasuries and then say we have an 8% projected rate of it. You have to put it in alternative investments. So you basically here have the tail wagging the dog, and it's in the nature of the systems. And by the way, if you, this is not the first time this has happened. This happened in California from 2000 to 2008. They put their alternative investments, driven by Treasurer Angelides and a number of other people, they put their alternative investments in real estate. They had to get a law passed so that they could invest in real estate. Between 2004 and 2007, they invested tens of billions of dollars in real estate in California, Florida, and Arizona, believe it or not. They lost 50% of the alternative investment portfolio. So what the big problem with these alternative investments is not, as it's being made out, the fees to Wall Street. Yes, that's a problem. The big problem is the risk to taxpayers. That has to be emphasized in all of this.
Well, thank you. And Mayor Riordan, Dan, do you have any final points before we go to questions?
Well, I think that people, if you look at Los Angeles or California, to realize that, like, California made 3% over the last 10 years average, and they were counting on 8%. The difference, 5%, gets compounded every year, and by the time like 12 years go by, you double all the debts. So it's a bomb, and it's going to go off, and I'd love to hear from the audience now.
All right, well, thank you. I'd like to now turn over to questions. Just please identify yourself with each question. That would be most helpful. We'll start with this gentleman straight in the middle, and just wait for a microphone if you don't mind. We've got one coming to you from over on that side.
My name is Francis Menton. Among other things, I run the Manhattan Contrarian blog. I'm astounded by the suggestions from this panel that there is a solution rather than an aggravation of the problem in a federal role in this matter. First of all, the states that have these pension problems, this isn't a random selection of states. It's not even most of the states. It's a minority of states, and it's the big blue states, Illinois, California, New York, New Jersey, Connecticut, not most of the rest. And second of all, as soon as the federal government gets into annuities and healthcare matters, they are at least as irresponsible as the states and are basically in the Ponzi scheme business today in Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid. What is the chance that a federal role in this area would be anything worse than a multiplication of the Ponzi schemes we're already in?
Well, I think we started to hear some of the restrictions and levers that would have to be in place. But Steve or Mayor Riordan, why don't
let
you
me
jump
just
in?
start. First of all, or let's qualify this. First of all, we're talking prospectively here for a couple of reasons. I do not favor a federal role whatsoever. However, and those of us on this panel who kind of work in this area are in contact with people in Washington a lot, including Republican and red state Democrats, who worry that if there are major systems that start to go out, it will trigger a financial collapse, which would require the federal government to get involved. You can say no, you can laugh, but that's going to be the argument in Washington. If that becomes the argument, we have to have a response. Part of the response is no, but if it is yes, only under these conditions. I think we're way down the road from that, but that is what they are worried about in Washington. And I'm talking about the most conservative legislators in Congress who are worried about this enough because they know that that is going to be the pressure if a major system goes out.
Right. And frankly, that is, to answer your question directly, that's a lot of the point of this panel. You hear different options. Some of them might make sense to you. Some of them might seem off base. But our hope is you walk out of the room today and you have a credible argument for or against each of these ideas that you can articulate. Mayor Riordan, anything you want to add on that?
Well, I think the simple thing is the states are not required to be part of the federal plan. It's voluntary. And so the states that are doing the best just would not opt to go into it. The other thing is each state pays a premium to the insurance that the federal government's doing based on how much is needed to cover their own problems.
Great. Next question. We have one from an online listener or viewer, or both.
Yes. The next online question comes from Ben Domenech, who is publisher of The Federalist, and he asks, realistically, won't major political compromise have to happen in order to have a shot at serious constitutional reforms? And, if so, which leaders and groups will motivate such compromise beyond thematical motivation?
It's a very thoughtful question. Do you want to start with that, Dan?
Well, I couldn't say to the Constitution. I think on the compromise thing, I think here the issue is that the Democrats are very divided, and partly they're divided by which offices they hold. The mayors and governors have become, in many cases, more pro-reform, whereas many of the Democrats that sit in state legislatures or on city councils are more skeptical of it, often more closely tied to the public employee unions. Republicans are under more pressure to seek retrenchment in this area than before. So really, if you're thinking about this as a three-cornered struggle, what you need to do is get the buy-in of at least part of the public employee unions in many cases. And one way to do that is through transparency measures that say that, look, it's going to be mutually assured destruction of all of us and the whole system unless actions are taken. That is, it's the math, in Gino Raimondo's phrase. I think the other way is to divide, in a sense, the public employee unions between the leadership and the older workers, and in a sense, unions often are more reflective of the views of older workers than they are of the younger workers, and say that really what we need is to make public employment more attractive, and that's going to be by mobilizing younger or newer workers to see that there could be benefits for them. So I think that would be a kind of a strategy that would say you need to, in a sense, to shift the two of the three corners of the struggle, the Democrats and the public employee unions, that's where you have to look to manufacture compromises.
So that's such an interesting response, because as I'm listening to both this panel and the one before, it's about these new demarcation lines. It's mayors versus state leaders. It's younger workers versus older workers. It's people who have paid in and people who are yet to receive. Private unions versus public unions. We haven't really talked about that yet today. But there seems to be many ingredients that go into the right coalition. We have a question up front from Josh Rao, our previous panelist.
Thanks. I've talked enough, so I won't talk long. But I did want to say, in terms of a federal role, you know, I personally have been in favor of something where there are some kind of carrots and sticks provided by the federal government. Talked a lot about what the sticks would have to be, that they would have to make contributions, that they might have to eliminate restrictions on benefit changes, possibly define contribution elements, something like that. But I think it's important to think about what these carrots would be. I've personally not been in favor of having an insurer, a federal insurer. I think the Pension Benefit Guaranty Corporation has been a disaster, a fiscal disaster, and I have a new paper that suggests that the total liabilities of the PBGC are an order of magnitude 10 times larger than what the government says they are. But I do think that there is a federal role for the reasons that Steve Malanga was talking about, in terms of you know, doing something, because otherwise there's going to be a massive bailout. And so I guess the questions for the panel are, what do you think that something should be? I propose maybe some tax deductibility for some kind of pension funding bonds or something, I don't know, some kind of tax break. And, or if you think it should be an insurer, how do we prevent the mistakes of the PBGC from getting repeated?
Well, I don't think it should be an insurer. I actually don't give the microphone up. Tell the audience what your alternative was, because I think that's probably more reasonable. And you know, forgetting about again all of the sticks, which we've already talked about. Explain yours, because I think that you've thought that through already. So.
Durations. One of them was that there could be some so pension obligation bonds. We talked about how abused those have been. But the idea is the following: if you can give state and local governments the incentive to stop the run-up of unfunded liabilities, okay, then maybe you could allow new pension obligation bonds to be tax deductible. That would be the idea. So you tell them, look, if you close the plans to new workers and put new workers on a truly sound plan, if you do make all these changes, then we'll give you back the tax deductibility of pension obligation bonds. That was my idea. You know, a really harsh stick would be the one that the Public Employee Pension Transparency Act that was sponsored by Darrell Issa and Paul Ryan, Devin Nunes, a few other people. Their stick, they actually had a thing that said you have to. It was a fairly light thing, because it was really about disclosure. But they said you will lose the tax deductibility of all municipal bonds if you do not disclose the pension obligation under an appropriate discount rate. That was their thing. So they didn't say you'll lose the tax exemption unless you close the plan to new workers or you eliminate DB plans. But they did say you will lose your municipal bond exemption. So I guess in terms of thinking about, that's sort of a really heavy stick.
It's almost the nuclear option.
That's almost
right?
the nuclear option.
It is a nuclear option, and given the choice, I would favor that. Except I don't think it would be constitutional, because I'm showing my prejudice here, but the tax code. I mean, the states effectively argued at the beginning of the tax code that the federal government does not have the right to tax their municipal bonds, and pension obligation bonds are taxed for another reason. They were abusing them basically as a form of arbitrage. So I would think that's a great solution. I'm not even sure the Supreme Court. I think that would be, it might not pass muster. It's an interesting question, though. But believe me, in Washington, if you talk to the people in Washington who are worried about this, and they've thought about how do we not cross the line in federalism, how do we not cross the line yet still bring the states into compliance on this, a lot of it is about the tax code. Because these pension systems are taking advantage of tax advantages which possibly could be withdrawn. You would need a very different Congress and maybe a very different White House in order to do something like that. Well,
elections are around the corner, right? We have some more questions. One in the middle, towards the back.
Thank you. The aforementioned mutually assured destruction option. First of all, the stick is reality, regardless of whether it's state, municipal, or federal. We have political arguments, political debates going on. What about the economic argument? Who pays for the carrot, regardless of whether it's the federal or state?
Who pays for the
We're
what?
talking about the
the
carrot
carrot,
and the stick. Yeah. Who pays for the carrot? The fact is the money has to be there. The federal government doesn't have a bank, so it can't pay for the carrot. And if you make a deal with the states, the taxpayer is the bank who eventually gets it, whether it's 5 years down the road or 10 years down the road. So instead of these political debates, why are we not focusing on the economic argument rather than the political will to do something or not? Reality is the stick is the reality.
Let me answer that, Ken. I think you had a very important point, and the basic thing is, that the city has to be very, very involved in it, because no matter what you say, the taxpayers are not going to be there to pay the extra taxes necessary to keep up with the unfunded liability. In fact, they'll move out or they'll just refuse to pay taxes, but it isn't going to work.
Yeah, and let me just add that there is an economic argument here. It is the only argument. The only circumstances under which this kind of federal program would even be considered would be because of a threat to the financial system, in which the damage to the financial system would outweigh economically the cost to the federal government. No one here is advocating anything less, but I'm telling you that there are a lot of people in Washington who worry that that's where we are heading. All you have to do is read Professor Ross' papers about how the impossibility of some of these states and cities actually paying back their pension obligation. So it is an economic argument in the sense that the only way I think that would even be considered in Washington would be if the economic consequences of some of these systems going down would be greater than the cost to the federal government.
Eileen, do you want to jump in on this?
Yeah, I would just say I think it's worrying because some of these places have already internalized the fact that they'll probably get a bailout. I think Governor Quinn had some language in a budget 2 years ago that said, well, the pension obligations will be federally guaranteed, like he was floating, his expectations. And then you're already seeing some money possibly flow to Detroit. And the worry there is that once they signal that to one or two cities, or once if that should occur, then where does it stop? So I think the federal government is right to worry, to do something preemptive to prevent that kind of thing, because some people may have internalized that the federal government will bail us out. Don't worry.
An implied guarantee, even if it's not stated. We have time for about 2 more questions. We have one up front here, and just wait for a microphone if you don't mind.
Good morning. Vanessa Van Braun. I'm a financial institutions banker with Wells Fargo, but relevant to this conversation, I was a police officer for 10 years and have a vested pension in the New Jersey State Police and Fire. So it's obviously an issue that's near and dear to my heart. We've talked about a lot of pension systems that have not worked. I'd be interested to hear from the panel, are there any examples that you've come up with that are positive examples and are fiscally healthy? And if so, what are the drivers and elements of those that maybe we could apply to other systems?
Thank you for that. It's important that we also look to the positive as well. I'll open that up to anyone in the panel.
I'll start by... I'm sorry, Dave.
Mayor Riordan, why don't you
let
take
me
this
answer
first?
that. I think the answer is I don't know of any. You could pick Rhode Island, for example, but the way they've done it is by changing their constitution and other laws to meet the problems with pensions.
Yeah, let me answer this. There are pension systems in the states, Utah's an example, there are pension systems that are not nearly in the kind of trouble that we're talking about. However, what distinguishes most of them, for the most part, up to this point, has not been a design. What distinguishes them, and this is what Alicia Minnell, who used to be on President Clinton's Council of Economic Advisors and is now the head of retirement research at Boston College said, she said, what distinguishes the states that are not in trouble is that they are fiscally responsible in other areas too. So it's not a design of a system that I can give you that's in place right now, but it's the fact that fiscally responsible states are responsible with their pension systems too. I mean, if that's a tautology, then that's...
All right, I'm trolling. Is there one out there? Rick Dreyfuss, you're in the back. You know pension systems. Can you mention one?
Michael, I would say, E.J. McMahon has a paper on this and shows some of the choices that we have, and since I'm a public employee, you have a choice if you're in the New York State public university system between basically a defined benefit and a defined contribution plan inside SUNY and CUNY. So if you choose the DC plan, which is more like a TIA CREF plan that was discussed in the first panel, I think there you see that the returns are almost as good. It takes the state out of the question of making taxpayers liable. So I think one might look there for models of both reform, because it allows workers the choice, and it ultimately takes the state out of being in this pro-cyclical situation of being responsible for the liabilities.
It really is a great example, and I urge you to read the report. It's available on the Empire Center's website as well as the Manhattan Institute's. Eileen, you got one to mention?
Sure. I think just building on that, states where, first of all, again, the accounting, their self-reported numbers make them look better funded than they actually are. On a risk-free basis, I don't think many states get above the 50% funding level. That was a tax foundation map that came out recently. But the states that are doing the best, Washington State, Milwaukee was cited as a well-run pension system. They're still more deeply underfunded than they recognize, but those states also have a habit of making their annual contribution, so they're well managed. And I think that's the point, is that well-managed cities are not going to be or states are not going to be as bad off as those that have abused their pension plans.
We have to go overseas? Really?
Overseas, because there they don't have these GASB rules. So you go to the Netherlands, just about everybody there has got some kind of defined benefit pension plan. They account for them using risk-free, default-free swap yields, which are between 0 and 4%. There was recently a debate as to whether, at the long end of the curve, so for an obligation that was more than 30 years out, you were allowed to use a rate that was higher than 4%. So their entire they're using 0% for a one-year obligation. They do it correctly, and they've got laws in place that say if it gets less than 96% funded, there has to be a commission that meets to recommend a combination of tax increases and benefit cuts to pay for these occupational defined benefit pensions. So I think if you go there, if you want to see a system that's done correctly, you got to go overseas.
Well, I'd like to bring this panel to a close on a positive note about a good example we could look to, and that's the higher education plans here in New York. Also a housekeeping item. One of our panelists is one of the kindest people I know. Her writing is incredibly hard-hitting, but she would never, call out misinformation from a friend. But earlier I said she was with George Washington University, and of course the Mercatus Center is with George Mason University. Big difference. But thank you, Eileen, for not embarrassing me. I'll do that myself. Mayor Riordan, thank you for joining us from Los Angeles, and I hope you have a great day, and thanks to all our panelists for this conversation.
I think it is clear how fortunate we are to believe in the power of ideas.
Supply the common sense and the fresh thinking of the Manhattan Institute.